Junkerqueen just received some massive buffs in the Overwatch 2 mid-season patch, and she might just be one of the best tanks in the entire game right now. Hi everyone, I'm Coach Tickety, and today we're going to be talking about what exactly makes Junkerqueen so busted right now, as well as give you some tips on how to play with one on your team or against one on the enemy team, since you're probably going to be seeing a lot of the Queen this season. If you guys like this type of content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for more educational content, you can head over to GameLeap.com. Over on the website, you will find hundreds of guides with more being added every single week that are designed by our top level coaches to help you learn and improve at the game. It doesn't matter if you're brand new to the game, picking up a new hero for this season, or really trying to test your limit and reach top 500 for the first time, GameLeap has the resources to help you reach your goals. So check out the link below this video or just head over to GameLeap.com and get your membership started today. Alright, now before we dive into the latest patch and all these new buffs that Junkerqueen received, I want to dive a little bit into her history and look at the older buffs she got in some previous patch notes. In December of 2022, she received an ultimate cost reduction and a buff to her wound healing, changing it from a 1 to a 1.25 times multiplier of any damage she does to her wounds. And shortly after, in January of 2023, she received a healing buff where any wound damage dealt to a target who is eliminated would instantly apply. The cooldown of her carnage swings would be reduced by the amount of targets that it hits, and her jagged knife was changed to deal more wound damage and less direct damage. All of these changes seem to push Junkerqueen into a self-sustaining juggernaut role where she should, in theory, be able to go toe-to-toe against frontliners and self-sustain any damage she trades back. But in reality, she usually fell behind other frontline tanks like Ramatra, Reinhardt, or Orisa. And now we have the most recent buffs for Junkerqueen in the mid-season 4 patch. Her scattergun ammo was increased, the projectile size of her jagged blade was increased, Rampage now deals direct damage and not only wound damage, and Adrenaline Rush, her passive healing based on wounds, is increased from a 1.25 times multiplier to a 2 times multiplier. This is by far the highlight of all of these patches that Junkerqueen has ever received. This wound buff alone makes Junkerqueen a very strong contender and actually very self-sustaining these days. A lot of those previous patch notes for Junkerqueen were focused on pushing her into a more self-sustaining role based around that Adrenaline Rush healing. And now that it has 2 times multiplier off any damage dealt by wounds, it's absolutely insane, and she can actually self-sustain herself in the frontline now. Also, even though Rampage was changed to not only deal wound damage, the buff to Adrenaline Rush means you're basically healing the same amount as you were before, but now you have the added benefit of dealing 40 immediate damage on impact. All of these changes essentially add up to Junkerqueen becoming this well-rounded frontline tank that relies on hitting big abilities to apply her self-sustaining wound damage. But is this enough to make Junkerqueen an extremely strong character or a must-pick in your games? Well, let's take a look at some of her matchups in the tank line and talk about where she fits in. Some of the most popular tank picks right now are focused either around frontline brawling, like with Reinhardt, Ramatra, or Orisa, or with hard all-in aggression with dives around Winston, Doomfist, or Wrecking Ball. There are plenty of other tank picks and they're popular enough, but these have been the sort of meta-defining characters as of this season. Starting off easy against those dive tanks, Junkerqueen actively counters most if not all of them. The sheer damage from her primary fire alone, which again got buffed to having more ammo this patch, is enough to force dive tanks to use their cooldowns defensively to either mitigate her damage or to move away from the Junkerqueen herself. So you'll be able to simply walk up to characters like Winston or Doomfist and make them respect your damage output. Additionally, if these tanks are using their cooldowns to get aggressive onto you or your teammates, aka if they are diving you, then your commanding shout is a great defensive tool to react to those moments and keep your team healthy, and if you hit any targets with a jagged blade, you can stop them from disengaging by simply pulling them back in when they try to back off. Just hit them in the face with a knife and wait for them to either jump or roll away respectively, and then pull them back in to finish the kill. But Junkerqueen has always had favorable matchups against dive characters since she puts out so much close range damage, and enemies closing the distance onto her is usually a good thing for the Queen. But now, in addition to beating dive tanks, she also has some favorable matchups against other frontliners. The range and damage of her scattergun, which is now more consistent thanks to the additional ammo, is great for poking out frontline tanks before they can reach you, and the threat of the jagged knife throw, which is easier to hit now thanks to its projectile size increase, is great for forcing defensive cooldowns out of tanks or potentially threatening backline members past the tanks if you can hit those long-range knives. But of course, most importantly compared to all of this is the Adrenaline Rush buff. With the 2 times healing now, you can actually stay in the front line for much longer and usually out-brawl a lot of tanks even if you're by yourself or cut off from your healers. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want against these types of tanks. You still need to make sure you're finding really strong value out of all of your cooldowns and taking smart positions around natural cover if you want to threaten them, but this does mean that you can almost always outlast them since they're relying on cooldowns or hard resources like shields, and you only rely on your passive, your self-sustain that you get from applying wounds naturally, which you will be doing constantly anytime you're in the front line with big carnage swings or any jagged knife throws. Simply put, thanks to the raw damage and healing numbers you'll be putting up as Junkerqueen, you cannot be ignored by the enemy team. This means a couple things. It means they'll be forced to put more resources into their front line and act more defensively by default if they're taking too much damage, and it also means that the more attention you take, the more open space there is for your DPS and supports to make their own aggressive plays. Even if you aren't able to take the most space or use the most defensive resources when compared to other tanks, the sheer threat of your existence is enough to change the way the enemies have to play around you. So as long as you're playing consistently, hitting enough knife throws, doing enough damage, and of course not dying for as long as possible, then you will be a powerful force for your teammates and you'll be able to take over games. I should also mention that there's a lot more room for mid-fight plays as Junkerqueen now. Thanks to your self-healing buffs, you won't need Commanding Shout to be used defensively as often, which opens up room for mid-fight aggressive shouts to get that speed boost or to apply overhealth to your teammates and really go all into a play. So yeah, overall, I would say Junkerqueen is in an amazing place right now and is incredibly strong overall, but that doesn't mean you can just one-trick her and expect the same success in every situation. So let's talk a little bit about where she finds the most value and when she feels a little bit weaker. In terms of maps, Junkerqueen feels most at home when she can contest important corners or choke points, which allows her to get on important enemy backliners who are forced into those types of positions. Think of maps like King's Row, Colosseo, or even Lijiang Control Center as examples here. On the other hand, Junkerqueen doesn't like maps with too many long open sight lines or an abundance of high ground since they offer too many different angles that Junkerqueen herself won't be able to actively contest. So for example, maps like Circuit Royale or ironically Junkertown, because of the long open sight lines, it's going to be hard to close those distances as the queen, or maps like Dorado, because of their abundance of high grounds, it's hard to contest all those different angles. In terms of teammates, Junkerqueen likes to play around independent playmakers, usually around characters that have a lot of independent mobility like Tracers, Genjis, Lucios, and Kirikos. Now I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive. These are usually the DPS or supports you would find with a dive-based composition. Something like a Winston or a Wrecking Ball might feel more at home here. But since Junkerqueen is such an independent threat, meaning she doesn't really need too much follow-up damage to find her own kills, she wants to present as many threats around the map as possible so that just in case she gets focused down, her other playmakers can go for a play in the enemy backline or on a flank or something like that. Also, it never hurts to have high mobility dive focused characters around a pick focused tank like Junkerqueen, since any value she finds in the front line can quickly be capitalized on by going all in with your DPS. Now, I don't have a list of characters that Junkerqueen doesn't want to play with on her team. I think it's too dependent on the situation. You can't always say what's going to be good or bad. It depends on the matchup more than anything. But basically, with a queen on your team, you almost never want to stack up all your threats in the same location, since it's going to be too easy to deny queen and your other DPS and supports at the same time with a single defensive cooldown like a barrier or a defense matrix. On the enemy team, queen thrives against characters that are very mobility dependent. Again, we've already talked about dive tanks being hard countered by Junkerqueen, but even dive DPS, if you threaten them with enough close range damage or a nicely timed knife pull, they'll almost always be forced out of the fight or risk dying themselves. But Junkerqueen does struggle against that long range damage where she can't quite close the distance against them, but this is usually map dependent, like I said, with those long sight lines or abundance of high grounds, but she also struggles against an abundance of close range pressure. So like I said, she can go toe to toe with other tanks, maybe like a Reinhardt or a Ramatra, but if they also have a Mei and a Bastion on their side, you really won't be doing much as Junkerqueen since they'll just be running you over. And this is again why Junkerqueen likes relying on independent DPS, because if she's able to survive the pressure of all three of those members, then at the very least her DPS or supports might be able to make a play on their own time that isn't reliant on Junkerqueen herself finding value. So in summary, Queen is ridiculous right now, and I highly recommend you give her a try even in just some quick play games to see how far you can push this hero to find success in your games. If you find yourself playing with a queen on your team, you don't want to play all around her like you would a traditional brawl tank like Ryan or Ramatra in the front line. Instead, you usually want to play around her and around the map so that you can present multiple threats all at the same time, since Queen doesn't really need much help being a threat of her own. And if you find yourself going up against an enemy Junkerqueen, you can try to counter her by outranging her with with extremely long sight lines or by relying on high grounds that she can't reach, just watch out for those jagged knife throws, or you can try stacking multiple heroes in the front line with a lot of utility like Mei walls or just a ton of damage from someone like Bastion to out-pressure her in the front line and make sure she doesn't find any value of her own. In any case, Junkerqueen is looking much better than just being a tall DPS this season, so you're probably going to see a lot more of her in your game, so you better get used to playing with her, playing against her, and maybe get used to playing her a little bit yourself. Anyway, that's all for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.